Welcome to Geekstorians, the show where we rewind through the stories that built geek culture, one obsession at a time. I'm Dave from Geektown, and today we're cracking open a black plastic time capsule from the 80s. It's clunky, heavy, sometimes unspools itself like a wounded octopus, but it changed everything. This isn't just nostalgia, it's a story about control. Who had it, who lost it, and how this rectangle of plastic handed it back to the fans. This is VHS versus the Gatekeepers. For me, the story of VHS didn't start in a shop. Weirdly, it started in a van. My dad ran a business which wasn't all that common in the UK. It was a door-to-door video rental service. Basically like a library on wheels. But instead of Dickens and Shakespeare, Dad's van would roll up into your street carrying Ghost, Home Alone and Dances with Wolves. The neighbours would step outside chatting under the streetlight as the engine ticked over, the back doors opened to reveal a row of VHS cassettes gleaming like treasure. The smell of warm plastic and petrol, that was my childhood cinema. Once a month, Dad would drive to the franchise warehouse to refresh the stock. And if I was lucky and I'd done all my homework, I got to go along and help. He needed to bulk out the catalogue with some older movies to sit alongside the limited number of those AAA titles. For me, this was the opportunity to roam these towering aisles and pick out the strangest titles I could find. Critters and all its sequels, The Toxic Avenger, The Class of Nukem High. In most cases, I had no idea what these films were about, but if it had a fun name or a ridiculous cover, it was going in the cart. Dad just needed tapes to fill the shelves. I was curating my own strange little film festival. But those evenings taught me that VHS wasn't just about entertainment. It was access to this whole weird and wonderful cinematic universe. And without that experience, I might not be sitting here today talking to you. This van brought the world's imagination to people's doorsteps, one little plastic brick at a time. Like I say, mobile video rental vans were rare, so if you didn't have one in your area, there was always the local video shop. A temple to carpet glue, cardboard sleeves and quiet temptation. You paced the aisles pretending to browse Police Academy 2 while sneaking glances at the forbidden wall at the back. Cannibal Holocaust, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, The Driller Killer. These were things that Dad definitely didn't have in his van. These were the films that newspapers said would corrupt civilization, but to you they just looked exciting. I think everybody remembers that wall. It was the physical embodiment of the VHS revolution. Not just entertainment, but freedom. 1,000 different worlds waiting behind a padlock and a look of disapproval. VHS didn't start as rebellion, but it did become one, because it asked a dangerous question. What happens when audiences, not studios, get to decide what is worth watching? The home video revolution started with a battle. An argument about tape length. It's 1975 and Japan's biggest electronics companies are locked in a quiet war for the world's living rooms. Sony steps up first with Betamax, a sleek, compact cassette with beautiful picture quality, exactly the sort of thing you'd expect from a company that worships precision. The only problem? It could record for 1 hour, which, if you're watching a feature film, meant that you were flipping tapes halfway through Jaws. JVC, meanwhile, takes a different tack. Their engineers decide that people don't want perfection, they want freedom. Freedom to record the whole film, TV shows, the adverts, and half the evening news if they fancied. Their new format, the video home system, would run for 2, 4, even 6 hours. It wasn't better, but it was longer, cheaper, and most crucially, open license. Unlike Sony's tightly controlled Betamax, any company could make a VHS deck. Within a few years, the world had chosen blur over beauty. Sony's execs were horrified, complaining that consumers had no taste.
Kids.
But it wasn't about taste, it was about time. For the first time, ordinary people could decide when to watch something. They could take Doctor Who while you were out and then watch it again, and again, and again, until the tracking lines became part of the show's aesthetic. You could pause a frame, study a special effect, or dissect a scene. Film students suddenly had a classroom in their lounge. Before VHS, movies were somewhat transient. You caught them at the cinema or you missed them. Television did offer reruns, but only on the broadcaster's schedule. VHS broke that cycle. It was the printing press of cinema, duplication without permission. Hollywood really didn't understand what was coming. Studio heads predicted disaster. If people can record our films, one executive warned, they'll stop going to the movies entirely. Jack Valenti of the Motion Picture Association compared home video to the Boston Strangler, murdering the film industry in its sleep. But by the end of the decade, home video sales would be the very thing keeping the lights on in Hollywood. At first, though, VHS belonged to the tinkerers and the true believers, those who saw not just a machine, but a form of liberation. Because the real revolution wasn't when we watched, it was that for the first time, we could choose. Before we move on, we do need to address the naked elephant in the room. In the battle between Betamax and VHS, one of the most decisive players came from an industry the tech magazines politely ignored: the adult film industry. Now, this isn't about scandal, it's about economics and access. These were independent producers who couldn't rely on mainstream cinema or studio distribution. They needed a cheaper, more flexible way to reach their audience, and they found it. Sony's Betamax might have been technically superior, but it was short on runtime, expensive to duplicate, and heavily restricted by Sony's licensing. VHS, meanwhile, was longer, cheaper, and open to anyone. JVC didn't care what you put on the tapes, they just wanted you to use one. By the late 1970s, adult filmmakers had almost entirely adopted VHS. It could hold an entire feature film on one cassette, it could be copied easily, and most importantly, it could be watched in privacy. No ticket booth, no sticky cinema floor, no awkward encounters with a theatre usher. In doing so, that industry accidentally proved the viability of the format. They demonstrated that people will buy and rent tapes, not just record from television. That proof of concept sent ripples through both Hollywood and the electronics world. The demand for longer recording times, the very feature that Sony had kind of dismissed, came directly from those early adopters. They didn't invent VHS, but they helped make it useful. When historians later asked why VHS had won, the answer wasn't salacious, it was simple. The format offered freedom of length, of licensing, of use. It simply worked. So yes, VHS conquered the world partly because it let you watch whatever you wanted, including things that polite society pretended didn't exist.
Oh my.
That's not a punchline, it's the essence of home video though. Whether it was a banned horror, an art house experiment, or something labelled for adults only, VHS gave the viewers autonomy. You decided what belonged on your screen, not a censor, not a critic, not a committee. The right to choose, even badly maybe in some cases, was baked into the machine. And that idea that ownership and privacy are power would soon terrify the people who'd spent half a century deciding what the public were allowed to see. While America was falling in love with the convenience, Britain was falling into a panic. The early 1980s brought a sudden flood of cheap videotapes from Europe and the US. Films made outside the studio system, often on shoestring budgets and dripping with theatrical gore. They arrived faster than anybody could classify them. No cinema release meant no British Board of Film Censors certificate. No certificate meant chaos, and chaos, in the British press, meant scandal. Headlines screamed of corruption of the young and the sick films in your living room. Tabloid reporters wrote about teenagers traumatized by horror movies they really couldn't have possibly seen. Conservative MPs waved VHS covers in Parliament like evidence at a murder trial. And into the moral vacuum strode one of the most determined crusaders in British media history, Mary Whitehouse. Whitehouse, the founder of the National Viewers and Listeners Association, had been railing against indecency on television since the 60s. Now VHS gave us something new to fear, a private cinema with no off switch. To her, these lurid tapes weren't just movies, they were an infection. The phrase video nasty came from a 1982 Sunday Times article, and once it was coined, it spread like wildfire. Suddenly a whole list of films became national villains. The Evil Dead, Driller Killer, Cannibal Holocaust, I Spit on Your Grave. Moral crusaders clutched at their pearls and screamed that something must be done. So in 1984, the government passed the Video Recording Act. Every video for sale or rental now had to be classified by the BBFC, turning what had been a grey market into a bureaucratic nightmare. Tapes were confiscated, shops were raided, and distributors fined. Police officers proudly posed beside stacks of seized tapes, like they'd taken down a drug cartel made of plastic bricks. But here's the irony. The crackdown didn't kill the culture, it supercharged it. Collectors began circulating uncut copies through the post, often on second or third generation tapes. The grainier the copy, the rarer the treasure. Fan networks quietly thrived in shadow markets of postal trades and pub back rooms. If the BBFC said it was a forbidden film, that became half the advertising. The British censors had accidentally invented the concept of underground fandom. A horror film wasn't just something to watch, it was something to hunt. You weren't a mere viewer, you were an archaeologist of forbidden art. And amongst all this hysteria, one truth remained. VHS had shifted the balance of power. For the first time in British history, you could choose what to see behind closed doors. No cinema chain, no scheduling executive, no moral guardian required. The establishment saw danger. Fans saw possibility. The tape was spinning and nobody could stop it. Every revolution needs a base of operations. For the VHS age, that place wasn't a Hollywood studio. It was a converted shopfront between a chippy and a laundrette. The video rental store became the cathedral of our culture. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. The air smelt faintly of plastic and despair. There was a poster of RoboCop curling in the corner and a handwritten note on the till that said, "Please be kind, rewind." And for anybody that grew up there, the ritual was sacred. Friday night, trip to the chippy, then to the video shop for a tape. Maybe two if you'd done all your homework. You paced the aisles like an explorer in a jungle of cardboard boxes. Action, comedy, romance, and that mysterious special interest section that everybody understood perfectly and then immediately pretended they didn't. But behind the counter stood the real heroes of the story, the video store clerk. Unpaid film school philosophers armed with encyclopedic memories and a deep mistrust of management. They were creators before Netflix had algorithms, recommending films by gut feeling and caffeine levels. One clerk might point you towards Withnail and I because you looked weird but witty. Another might press the Evil Dead 2 into your hands with a solemn nod, as if inducting you into a secret order. They spoke in quotes, ranked directors like footballers, and treated rare input VHS like the Holy Grail. And these weren't just movie buffs, they were future auteurs in disguise. A young Quentin Tarantino spent his 20s behind the counter at video archives in California, devouring every film genre from samurai epics to French noir until he could stitch them together into Pulp Fiction. Kevin Smith famously did the same thing in New Jersey, sketching dialogue between customers that would become clerks. And in San Fernando Valley, a teenage Paul Thomas Anderson was studying film history one rental at a time, the groundwork for Boogie Nights and Magnolia. The video store was the University of Geek Filmdom, open late, low fees, and no entrance exam beyond enthusiasm. It was also social media before the internet existed. The staff knew what you liked, what you pretended to like, and what you were too embarrassed to rent. They were your recommendation algorithm, your gossip column, and sometimes your confessor. But there was something else: community. You bump into classmates clutching the Terminator, argue over whether Gremlins counted as horror, and maybe, just maybe, discover a friend who loved the same obscure anime or martial arts flick that you did. This was fandom in physical form, tactile, awkward, human. A place where taste was forged through conversation, not code. You learnt by debating, by watching, by rewinding the good bits and skipping the dull ones. By the late 80s, Britain alone had more than 20,000 rental stores. It was one of the fastest growing industries in the country, and every single one was a little temple to choice, a place where the gatekeepers had to stand aside and let the public browse. But something else was stirring, because VHS wasn't just about watching other people's films, it was about making your own. By the mid-1980s, VHS had already conquered the living room, but another gadget was about to invade the garage: the camcorder. Heavy as a kettlebell, balanced on one shoulder, and guaranteed to make every uncle at a wedding look like a war correspondent. In the 1970s, a few dreamers had tried, armed with Super 8 cameras and miles of rattling celluloid. And that tiny gauge of film let teenagers shoot space epics in the garden and art school bands make their own music videos. But developing and editing still cost a fortune. The camcorder changed all that. Suddenly the darkroom disappeared, the lab was your lounge, and every home became a potential film studio. Now, initially they weren't all that cheap, but for the price of a decent holiday you could direct your own sci-fi epic in your back garden. And kids that grew up renting movies started remaking them long before anybody coined the term Sweding. Years later, a Jack Black comedy would give that DIY spirit a name, but in the 1980s it was just what you did when you loved a film so much you couldn't bear to wait for the sequel. There were backyard versions of Star Wars, Ghostbusters, Indiana Jones, complete with cardboard sets and lightsabers made out of wrapping paper tubes. One famous example, Raiders of the Lost Ark, the adaptation, was shot by 3 teenagers in Mississippi over several summers. It took them nearly a decade, but they did finish it. When Steven Spielberg himself finally saw it, he sent them a letter of congratulations. It was rough, ridiculous, but absolutely pure joy. In bedrooms and basements across the world, the same thing was happening. Sci-fi fans were making fake news reports about alien invasions. Wrestling fans have filmed entire backyard federations. Friends recreated The Evil Dead scene for scene using ketchup and lawnmowers. They didn't need permission, just a blank tape and a sense of mischief. Meanwhile, whole subcultures began to trade their homemade creations and their home-recorded tapes. The tape trading scene joined the postal underground. Fans swapped their homemade epics along with pro wrestling events taped off late-night TV, bootleg concerts, plus obscure anime from Japan and banned horror films from Europe. Each generation of copying left the image a little fuzzier, but that degradation became its own badge of authenticity. If your copy looked a little too clean, it wasn't quite real. This was the internet before the internet, a network built on postage stamps and trust. Every padded envelope that changed hands was a tiny act of rebellion against scarcity and corporate control. Shows like Mystery Science Theater 3000 captured that spirit and turned it into comedy, a man with 2 robots riffing on terrible B-movies, inviting the audience to laugh, to participate, and to treat pop culture like a conversation rather than a sermon. The punk movement had already taught musicians they didn't need a record label. VHS was teaching film fans the same lesson. You don't need a studio. You just need a camcorder, a dream, and a forgiving set of neighbours. And from those fuzzy beginnings would emerge a new kind of creator. Filmmakers who saw cinema not as an ivory tower, but as a sandbox. They didn't wait for permission, they just press record. And while these homemade auteurs were finding their voice, another movement was quietly forming around the films that refused to die. The outsiders, the oddballs, and the ones too strange for Saturday night television. Every generation has its myths, and every myth needs believers. VHS gave us both. By the late 1980s, cult film meant something new. It wasn't about box office or critics anymore. It was about stories that survived despite both. Movies too strange, too niche, too messy to fit into the mainstream. And in 1994, one man with a stack of maxed out credit cards and a shop full of tapes accidentally became the patron saint of that movement: Kevin Smith. Smith spent his 20s behind the counter of a small New Jersey convenience and video store, arguing about Star Wars continuity and recommending Chasing Amy before it existed. When he finally decided to make his own film, he couldn't afford colour stock, so he shot Clerks on black and white 16mm film, funded with maxed out credit cards and the sale of his comic book collection. He didn't choose shooting on film over VHS out of snobbery, it was a strategy. In the early 90s, no festival or distributor would even look at a movie that was actually shot on VHS, as opposed to being distributed on it. 16mm was the cheapest way to make something that looked like a real film and something that could be screened at Sundance instead of just passed around on tape. It gave his DIY dream a fighting chance of being taken seriously. And it worked. Clerks looked rough, but not disposable. It was the perfect echo of the culture that had raised him. It was a love letter to the VHS generation, to late-night debates, movie quotes as social currency, and fans who treated cinema like religion. If Tarantino was the video store encyclopedia turned auteur, Kevin Smith was the kid who handed you a tape and said, "Trust me, this one's brilliant." From there, the idea of cult exploded. VHS became the bloodstream of subculture. Horror, anime, queer cinema, anything that didn't belong anywhere else. Films like The Evil Dead 2, Repo Man, Akira, Withnail and I, The Rocky Horror Picture Show, they weren't handed to audiences, they were discovered. They were passed along by friends, rewatched until the tape wheezed, memorized like sacred scripture. VHS made them immortal, one fuzzy copy at a time. And part of that appeal was the chase and choice. When I was at college in the mid-90s, my mates and I would grab a few beers and head down to the local video shop on a boring Wednesday night, when we probably should have been studying. We'd set ridiculous themes, like the cover had to have something round on it, or a hand reaching around a door, or the title had to start with a T but also contain a Z. We'd roam the aisles laughing like idiots, arguing whether Tremors counted because the worm was technically cylindrical. Half the time we'd end up renting something completely dreadful like Troll 2 or Texas Chainsaw Massacre 3, but that was the point. It wasn't about good or bad, it was about discovery and daftness. That's what the video shop did. It turned browsing into a kind of game, a sort of social sport played with plastic bricks and far too much optimism. In Britain, cult movies found their community in late-night pub screenings and student film societies that sprang up around university towns. Someone's mate would know a guy with a multi-region player. Someone else would smuggle a copy of Eraserhead in from Amsterdam. And for 2 hours, you'd sit transfixed, not sure if you are horrified, enlightened, or just hypnotized by the sheer weirdness of it. Owning a copy of Brazil or A Clockwork Orange, still banned for decades in the UK at that point, wasn't about taste, it was a statement. It said, "I found this, I kept it alive." The home video shelf became a form of autobiography. Each spine told a story, the childhood favourites, the forbidden discoveries, the empty space of films that you'd loaned out and never got back. In an age before online profiles, your VHS collection kind of was your personality, a magnetic resume of obsession. You could almost chart the rise of modern geekdom along those shelves. Animation fans trading Akira and Ghost in the Shell, horror devotees quoting Sam Raimi by heart, audiences discovering LGBTQ cinema through whispered recommendations, turning outsiders into community. VHS made the strange accessible, and in doing so, it made the outsiders visible. For the first time, film fandom wasn't about escape, it was about identity. So yeah, VHS was clunky, unreliable, occasionally melted in the sun, but it did something miraculous. It took movies the world had rejected and said, "Don't worry, you've got a home now." And from those shelves of oddity and treasure, a new kind of cinema would rise. One the studios couldn't ignore forever. For a decade, Hollywood had dismissed home video as the enemy. And then they opened their books and realised the enemy was paying the bills. By the late 80s, VHS rentals were making more money than cinema tickets. Blockbusters like E.T., Top Gun, Ghostbusters and Batman didn't just rule the box office, they dominated the living room. The sale of a single cassette could earn more than a week in the theatres. The format that was supposed to kill movies had quietly become its life support machine. Studio executives changed their tune overnight. The same people who called home video piracy were suddenly releasing glossy catalogues of collectible editions. The new slogan, "Own the movie you love." And we did. Entire wall units filled with identical black rectangles, each promising that happiness could be rewound at 25 frames a second. But with the success came domestication. The rebellious energy of the underground began to look more like a marketing strategy. When a film didn't justify a cinema release, it went direct to video. At first that sounded like Exile, where forgotten sequels went to die. And then the numbers rolled in, and the studios realised there was gold in that there bargain bin. The shelves begin to swell with inexpensive spin-offs, Tremors 2, Starship Troopers 2, The Crow, City of Angels, and a whole ecosystem of low-budget action movies starring whoever was available that week.
Lock and load.
Disney joined in. Aladdin 2, The Return of Jafar, went straight to VHS and sold millions, even with the voice of Homer Simpson stepping into the unfillable shoes of Robin Williams' Genie.
No!
A sequel factory was born, and even cult directors weren't immune. Sam Raimi, once the poster child of banned horror, found himself making studio superhero films. Peter Jackson graduated from bad taste to Lord of the Rings. The outsiders had been invited inside, handed bigger budgets, and asked very politely not to swear.
Damn.
VHS had trained us to love the imperfect, the scrappy, the human. And now the studios were feeding us processed versions of that same rebellion. The spirit of the backroom rental shop repackaged in shrink wrap. And yet, part of you couldn't help but smile. Because for every corporate cash grab, another oddball vision slipped through. Clerks, The Blair Witch Project, Al Mariachi, all made possible by cheap cameras, cheap tape, and a generation raised on fast forward. Hollywood had absorbed the VHS kids, but the VHS kids had hacked Hollywood from the inside. But every revolution wears out its spools, and by the mid-90s a new disc was glistening on the horizon. Perfect picture, no rewinding, no fuzz, and no soul. The end of the VHS era didn't arrive with a bang, it arrived with a whir. In 1997, the first DVD players hit the high street. Sleek, silver, smug little boxes that promised perfect picture and perfect sound. You couldn't accidentally tape over them, you didn't have to fiddle with the tracking. You pressed play and the film simply obeyed. It was the dream of every frustrated kid who'd ever shouted, "Mum, you've recorded Neighbours over Aliens!" But perfection, as always, came with a price. Whereas VHS was tactile and unpredictable, DVD was clinical. Gone was the thrill of static, the suspense of whether the tape would jam halfway through the thing. Instead, you got menus that lectured you about piracy and bonus features that promised enlightenment was mostly just offering talking heads saying, "We had fun on set." Collectors loved the convenience, the commentaries and the crisp picture, but for many, something subtle had vanished. The VHS was an experience. You could smell it, hold it, hear it grind. It felt alive. DVDs, by contrast, felt like artifacts sealed behind glass. They turned film watching into consumption again, the very thing that VHS had liberated us from. You didn't rent a mystery anymore, you purchased a product. But still, the promise was irresistible. A whole library of human cinema, remastered, reorganised, and the definitive version. You could finally own Kubrick's entire back catalogue without risking a fuzzy copy of 2001 taped off Channel 4. But here's the paradox. The more we owned, the less we cherished. Once every film was available, few felt special. The scarcity that made VHS fandom so passionate disappeared overnight. And with it, the culture of discovery, replaced by comfort browsing. And then came the coup de grace. Streaming. No discs, no shelves, no waiting. The dream of infinite access finally achieved. And the spirit of ownership erased completely. We stopped rewinding, stopped remembering. The algorithm became our clerk, our curator, our censor. It told us what to watch next, and we exhaustedly agreed.
Okay.
VHS had been democracy by magnetism. The power to choose, to collect, to share. Streaming gave us convenience of choice without the connection. It's fast, it's clean, it's efficient, and somehow feels like nothing at all. Every new format promises to bring us closer to the story, sharper pictures, faster access, fewer glitches. But maybe that's what VHS got right by accident. From its very conception, it never pretended to be perfect. It wobbled, it hissed, it sometimes chewed the tape, but the magic was still there. The flaws were sort of part of the experience. And even now the tapes are gone, the spirit isn't. Because if VHS taught us anything, it's that our stories don't disappear when the format changed. They rewind, replay, and find new audiences all over again. If you grew up on VHS, you remember the sound, the clunk when the tape hit the deck, the quiet pause, the motor sighing, ka-chunk, and then silence. The credits still rolling, the picture dimming, the story complete. And that's where we are now, at the end of the reel. The VHS cassette wasn't elegant or sleek or even reliable, but it changed who owned the story. Before it, movies belonged to the studios and the schedulers. After it, they belonged to us. Every rewind button was a little act of rebellion. Every bedroom shelf a personal film festival. It made fandom tangible. You could lend a film, record a show, discover a director by accident. It made community out of curiosity. And that's the real legacy. VHS didn't just preserve movies. It preserved connection. It let people touch their passions, share them, argue about them, and sometimes build their lives around them. The clerks became directors, the collectors became critics, the bootleggers became archivists, and the fans became the next generation of storytellers. So when a streaming app recommends you the same 5 blockbusters again, remember, once upon a time you had to fight for the weird stuff. You had to know somebody who knew somebody with a copy of Akira or Evil Dead 2. And that hunt made it mean something. Technology moved on as it always does, but the instinct VHS unleashed, the hunger to choose, to curate, to share, that's still the pulse of geek culture today. Because whether it's a stack of tapes, a digital playlist, or a folder marked Do Not Delete, we're still doing the same thing, holding on to stories that define us. So be kind, rewind. Not the tape, but the idea. The belief that culture belongs to everyone who loves it enough to keep a copy. I'm Dave from Geektown, and this has been Geekstorians. If you want the latest TV, film, or gaming news, or more stories from the history of geek culture, the people, the tech, the beautiful chaos in between, you'll find them all at geektown.co.uk and on our sister show, Geektown Radio. Join us next time.